Exodus. We'll turn to the book of Exodus, and I want to ask our men who's helping to go ahead and pass out our sheets tonight, and we are going to do it as a class, and so this will be the format for Wednesday night, and I hope it will be a blessing to you, and that we'll all learn many, many things from the book of Exodus. As we're passing those out, let me just give a brief overview of some of the things that we've learned in the book of Genesis the last few years. We begin with, of course, the beginning of all things, how God created the heaven and the earth. And we learned about the flood of Noah's day, and we learned about many, many others. We learned about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and we don't want to forget people like Enoch and all of those that we learned about. And after Jacob, we learned about Joseph, of course, and when Jacob came to the end of his life, he called his sons to him, and he conveyed upon them many blessings, and in many ways prophesied what their future would look like. And then he spoke to Joseph, and he imparted to Joseph the commandment of where he was to be buried. Joseph was a very trustworthy man. Joseph was someone that could be trusted with any assignment. And so his father told him to make sure that he was buried in the cave of Machpelah, in that parcel of ground that he had purchased there from Shechem, there in the land of Canaan. So he wanted to make sure that he was to be buried there. And then Joseph, he asks leave of Pharaoh and goes back to Canaan, brings the body of his father, and they bury him there. And then, of course, we know that there was a great mourning that took place, great weeping over his father, and he is buried there. And then we come to the very end of Joseph's life, and we learn about how that he dies, and before he dies, his brothers come to him and plead with him that he would forgive them for the evil that they had done against him in selling him to the Ishmaelites. And of course, Joseph says that you may have thought evil against me, but God meant it for good. And that was the attitude of Joseph. Joseph's attitude was not, what they did against me, but his attitude was, how was God working through all of this? And of course, God saved many people alive by using him that way. And he comforted them, spake kindly to them, all of that. And then we learned that he died, and as he was dying, he once again promised the children of Israel that God would visit them, and he would bring them out of the land that they were in, the land of Egypt, and bring them back to the promised land. So Joseph once again reiterates that promise and reinforces it and says, you will return to Canaan as the Lord has promised. But with that, he made them take an oath that when he died, they would bury him there, but then ultimately when they left when they left Egypt, that they would take his bones with him back to the land of Canaan. So Joseph wanted to be buried, of course, in his inheritance, the land of Canaan, which came to pass, recorded in Joshua 24 and verse 32, where he was buried in that parcel of land that was bequeathed to him by his father. And so we know the cross-reference there in Hebrews 11 verse 22, by faith Joseph says that he made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. So Joseph was not only a man of faithfulness, but he was a man of faith. And so he believed and knew that God would bring Israel out of Egypt one day. And so he dies, and they embalm him there in Egypt. And that's recorded for us, how that the Egyptians embalmed him there. So when we come to Exodus, chapter number 1, well, first of all, let's talk about the name of the book. The name of the book, Exodus, I think we all could probably take a very intelligent, educated guess that it means coming out. It means a moving from one place to another. An exodus is when we're leaving one place and going to another. That's what Exodus means. And so the children of Israel were going to make an exodus out of Egypt. And so the book of Exodus is going to cover many, many different topics. The law is given and all that later on in the book. But the central theme of Exodus is not even the law, but the central theme of Exodus is the deliverance of Israel from Egypt, because we learn how they're in Egypt, and we learn how that all of the children of Israel came to Egypt. Jacob took his whole family there, and there they are for many, many years. But the book of Exodus is going to tell us how they come out of there. So we're in Exodus chapter 1, and what I like to do is just read through this first chapter, and then there's some things we want to look at, and I hope it will be very educational for each of us. Exodus chapter number 1, we'll begin in verse 1. Now these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher, and all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, in all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick and in all manner of service. In the field, all their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, When ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then you shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives, and said unto them, Why have you done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied, and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. This is the story of how Israel multiplies in Egypt. And so today we're learning how that Israel, beginning with those 70 souls, multiplies into a great nation. And there they are in Egypt. They are living there. They're making their residences there. They're raising their families there. But eventually, Joseph dies. All of his brethren die. And all that generation, so everyone whom were recipients of the kindness of Pharaoh and Joseph, all those who came into Egypt with Jacob, they all died. All that generation died. And King Pharaoh died, the one who knew Joseph. But then we learned that the next Pharaoh came up. And so the name Pharaoh is not a first name. not like Joe or John or Harry or Susan or Mary or something. Pharaoh is a title. And so the king was called Pharaoh. That was his title. And so when one Pharaoh died and then his son came in after him, or whoever was the next predecessor, or the successor is what I mean to say, whoever the successor was would also be called Pharaoh. That was just the name of the king of Egypt, what he was called. And so he comes up, and this king, particular king, didn't know Joseph. Joseph lived before he became king, and he was not in any way amicable toward the children of Israel. He had nothing to lose, nothing to win, nothing to gain. The children of Israel became in many ways a burden to him because of the fact that they multiplied exceedingly, and because they began to fill the land. Pharaoh was thought that, well, we don't really want these people around, and if they are around, we want to make sure that they're under our control, because we don't want them to stand up and start fighting against us when the enemy shows up. So what we're going to do is just look through our lesson sheet here. There's some questions that we're going to answer that I think we all know well, and then we'll have a little commentary to perhaps learn some more things about that. So from our reading today, how many people came with Jacob into Egypt? 70 is the correct answer. In fact, it says 70 souls. Now, if you were to ever look at Acts chapter 7, the number there is listed as 75, and there's no disagreement there, but when you really think about it, it depends on how you count, because sometimes the kindreds was counted, but not the wives, and so when it said all of his kindred, it could include them or not include them. Also, Joseph was in Egypt, and he was married, had 2 sons, and then if you didn't include Jacob, the one who was the father of all these people, then that would subtract 5 from it. So I'm just saying there's different ways to count that, but what happened was Jacob came into Egypt with 70. So Joseph was already there, but Jacob came into Egypt with 70, and it lists all of his children. All 11 of them are listed, Reuben all down to Asher. So we have, first of all, the 6 sons of Leah are mentioned, then Benjamin being the son of Rachel, then the 2 sons of Bilhah, the handmaid, and then the 2 sons of Zillah. And then Joseph, of course, is then mentioned separately. So the children of Israel are here, and all the fathers of the tribes, Reuben, Levi, Gad, they're all dead. They all die. And they begin to multiply. And the children of Israel are growing and exponentially multiplying and filling the land. Was that a question? Acts chapter 7. Forgive me for not having the actual verse, but Stephen is giving a whole history of Israel. So somewhere around 20-something maybe in Acts chapter 7. Yes. Stephen there is preaching, and he's explaining, he's leading them to something. He explains all the history of Israel. He starts with Abraham, and he comes all the way to Christ, and talks about how Christ was the one that they were looking for. So, number 2, what happened as the children of Israel remained in Egypt? What happened to them? Okay, so we're a little ahead, but that was correct. They multiplied. So the first thing that happened was they multiplied as they're in Egypt. Now, Pharaoh had a couple different options, right? He could have just let them go. He could have said, well, let's assimilate. Let's just let them kind of just, mingle with our culture and become part of us. He could have done that, right? He could have just let them alone. But we have to understand the kind of the nationalism of Egypt. Egypt was a very proud nation. They didn't want mingling and mixing. They didn't want other nations to kind of threaten them. So you think about Israel, right? They've multiplied, and so now they're a threat. That's the way they're viewed by Egypt, because where are they living? Do you remember? The land of what? Goshen, very good. So they're in the land of Goshen, which is just northeast of, just that northeast part of the Nile Delta, really. So it's only a northeastern part of the whole country. It's not a big area. They're not taking the whole land. But that land of Goshen was really the most fertile. It was really the best, the most verdant. It's where many would feed their flocks. It was a very nutritious, lush area. And so the children of Israel live there, and they're taking up a lot of that. And so Pharaoh, he didn't really like this because he saw them increasing abundantly, multiplying. And so he comes and he says this in verse 10, "Come on, let us deal wisely with them." In other words, we're not talking about using wisdom here. We're talking about, let's do something smart, is basically what he's saying. We want to make sure that these children of Israel are not going to insurrect one day and stand up and basically overthrow the government. And that's what we're dealing with, is a tyrannical form of government. So this form of government that Egypt had would, for example, be similar to what we've seen with Venezuela. A government that is it's despotism. It's a tyrannical form of government. And so we call that a monarchy. And so he's the ruler. Pharaoh's the ruler, and he wants everything to be a certain way, and he doesn't want any threats in the land. So the children of Israel become a threat to him. So what did the new Pharaoh want to do with the children of Israel? That's number 3. That's a good answer. I think there's different ways we go with that, but he wanted to control them. He didn't want them to, one day come against him. So he wanted them to be in check. So we could say he wanted to control them. He wanted to, diminish them, as we'll learn in a little bit. And so really, he wanted to do something to keep them under his charge so that they would not multiply and become more of a threat to him. So here's a question, which maybe it's somewhat one of the same, but number 4, why was he concerned? Why was he concerned about the children of Israel multiply? Why did that matter to him? Right, so that's what we talked about, right? They were a threat, right? So he was concerned about it because they were threatening him. They were, it was a fear to him that they would be a problem if he was ever in a war. So, and I think too, he was concerned about it because it could possibly thwart or somehow diminish his own authority, right? And so he wanted to have absolute authority. So when a king becomes a monarch, he doesn't care about any of the people. When you get to where it's absolute authority, and we have governments like that, if you want to call them governments, we have systems of governments like that in the world today. North Korea would be one. Venezuela, was one. Iran was one. And they're in a lot of turmoil right now and protesting. People are trying to rise up against that, and a lot of people get killed doing that because that's a dangerous thing to do. When you're in a situation where it is a monarchy or tyrannical form of government, then to try to stand up against that means it could cost your life. And so that's the kind of government we have to understand. So when those Hebrew midwives didn't obey the king, they could have been killed. That's just the kind of government that it was. So Pharaoh is not a leader who cares about his people. The right idea of a leader is he wants to protect his people, right? He wants to protect his people. He wants to guard them from evil. He wants to bear the sword for those who are doing evil. He wants justice, right? That's what a good leader would want. He would want all those things. But he doesn't care. See, Pharaoh only cares about himself, about his reputation, and about how his country stands in the world. He's not concerned with the citizens in that country. That's just not his concern. So then it begins to explain in verse 11. They set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. They built Pharaoh treasure cities, Python, and Ramses. So if you ever go to Egypt, I don't know if you ever plan on going to Egypt, but if you did, just imagine in your mind, or you looked at a picture of Egypt, you'll see things like the great, pyramids, and also the great Sphinx is another one there. So those great structures which are considered, some of the 7 wonders of the world, It has been said and at least thought that the children of Israel could have helped in the construction of those. And they're still standing today, which is absolutely amazing. Most things that were built that long ago don't stand anymore. But the children of Israel made some of those. So when we look at things like the pyramids, those have been around for thousands of years. And why did they make those pyramids? Anybody know? They were to serve as what? The pyramids were supposed to be what? Tombs for the pharaohs. See, that's why it says here they built for Pharaoh treasure cities. So, again, it's all about the king. The Pharaoh wants treasure cities, and he wants to put all his treasures, and he could hide gold in there, whatever he wanted to do. And that would be where he'd be buried. His coffin would be there one day. He'd be embalmed and tombed. And pharaohs are still there, to this day. So, that was the whole purpose here. They wanted to just make their lives as hard as possible, and to afflict them, and just do forced labor. And by the way, a lot of people don't know this, but that stuff's going on today. Pakistan is a place where that's happening, where people who are considered the lowest of the low and are considered slaves are in the brick kilns, and they are making brick, exactly like what they did. Making brick and building things all hours of the day, and a lot of Christians are having to do that because they're considered the lowest in those Islamic countries. So a lot of us don't realize that. There is forced labor going on in the world. Unfortunately, there's some child labor going on in different parts of the world, and that's all hideous. And that's what's happening here. He says, okay, we'll do anything we can to constrict them. We don't want them to multiply, so we're going to try to make their lives hard. So here's number 5. What did Pharaoh first do? What's the first step that he took in hopes of diminishing Israel's numbers? Okay, serve with rigor. Who did he set over them? Taskmasters, which means rulers, governors, heads, captains. So basically these taskmasters were tasked by their master, who's Pharaoh, to just make things as hard as possible. So they wouldn't let him take breaks, these sort of things. Now, I've read things about that, and I do believe that they didn't work necessarily every single day. I think the slaves worked certain days and did maybe have some time off that they didn't work. But really, when these slaves are working, which is what the children of Israel ended up being in bondage, they ended up being slaves, they were watched, and they would be beaten if they were not delivering as was expected. And so under harsh conditions, maybe malnutrition, not a lot of water, things like that. So that just kind of gives us a little bit of a picture. It kind of paints a little bit of a picture of what the Israelites were going through. So they built cities. I mean, a city's pretty big, right? They're building whole cities. That's what so that tells us a couple things. Number one, how many there were, right? How many children of Israel there were. But it's also telling us how much they were required to do, that they would build whole cities. And if you were ever to walk up to those pyramids and you were to look at them, you'd see how big these bricks and these stones and these very large blocks are. You don't carry that by yourself on your shoulder. These are multiple people carrying them one at a time. So that just helps us understand a little bit about the slavery. And by the way, they say today, I don't know if my numbers are exactly correct, but somewhere around, I want to say 40 million slaves in the world today. So there's still a lot of slavery going on, and we don't sometimes realize that because we've abolished that in our country. And so we don't have slavery per se. It doesn't mean we don't have some places that people are working and they're not under good conditions, and and there ought to be reform in that. But there is some cases like that even in our country. But in other places of the world, mainly, there is slavery. When I speak about slavery, I'm talking about even where people are being sold and bought, that kind of slavery. That's going on, where they're not given the same dignity that you and I would be given, or that every human being should be given, but they're sold and these sorts of things. So these Israelites were made to serve with rigor. But what happened? The more they afflicted them, what? The more they grew. Now, why is that so? Well, it could just be God was blessing them. God was allowing them to grow and multiply. And this hard work that they were having to do every single day was not keeping them from multiplying as a people. So they continue to multiply. And so this is very frustrating, very vexatious to King Pharaoh. We're trying to inhibit these people, and it's not working. And the same thing happened in the early church. The same thing happened. Because, people like Nero thought to himself, okay, well, I'm going to persecute the Christians, and we're going to eradicate them. Well, you know what he did? When he did that, the Christians actually multiplied more and more. And historically, whether we like it or not, historically, the way it works, the Christians who are persecuted are the ones who actually end up growing. And that's what happens. In Acts, we know about how Stephen was persecuted, he was killed, martyred. And then there arose kind of a fear about that, and they scattered and went to other parts of the Roman Empire and ultimately grew the Christian faith as a result of that. So that's why they say the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, because the church actually ends up growing through that. So in other places of the world right now, Iran is a place where there's a lot of persecution, and the church has been growing greatly there. China, it's hundreds of millions of Christians there as far as we know. And there's severe persecution there. A lot of them are underground. So it never works the way mankind thinks it's going to work. They think, well, we can destroy God's people by afflicting them and persecuting them and doing everything we can to stop them. But it never works that way. And it actually turned out to be the opposite. So this is what he tried. He tried to set up taskmasters. He made them serve with rigor. Now, what does that mean? The word rigor means severity or cruelty. That's the way they made them serve. They say, hey, come on, you can do better. They do, just constantly prodding them, constantly, that's not good enough, that's not good enough, that's not good enough. Constant negative feedback. So it was a cruel thing. Their lives were bitter. It means grievous or vexatious or hard. Their lives were bitter with hard bondage and mortar and brick. And by the way, that's hard work. If you've ever been involved in masonry and brick and mortar, that's hard work. There's no question about that. And this is what they're doing all day. Mortar and brick, all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. So, indiscriminately, this is the way they're all being treated. Okay? Now, King Pharaoh has a problem, right? Because his plan is not working. His plan is backfiring, in fact. His plan is having the opposite effect. So he says, well, how about we just start eliminating them? How about we just make it impossible for them to multiply? Let's just destroy all the boys that are born, because we can keep them multiplying. So here's what it says. King of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives in verse 15. He gives the names here, Shiphrah and Puah. Now these names are given to us. This first name, Shiphrah, means brightness. And the name Puah means glitter or brilliancy. And so we're just imagining these midwives, wonderful ladies. So he said to them, to the midwives, specifically the Hebrew midwives, who were going to help Hebrew women give birth, he said to them, when they're on the stools, if it be a son, you shall kill him. If a daughter, then she shall live. So number 6, what did the king command the Hebrew midwives to do? Kill all the boys. Exactly. Okay. He made a command. He said, when they're on the stools, what does that mean? Well, there was a certain way the Egyptians did things, and so there was an apparatus where he had 2 stools, and the midwife would be on one, the mother that was bearing the child would be on the other. And it was just, and that was, the word stools actually means 2 stones, so it was the way they had this set up. If that's of interest to anybody, the way things were done there. And so the midwife would be there to help that mother to give birth. And so he gave them this commandment. He said, kill all the boys if it's a boy. By the way, and I say this in all seriousness, this is the first occurrence of mass abortion. That's what it is. Because it seems to me, and I don't mean to be crude in any way, but it seems to me that they were killing the babies possibly before they were even born. Because as soon as they knew what it was, okay? I know that's hard to think about. But this is abortion. And how do I know that? Because when the midwives say later, oh, well, the king says, why didn't you kill them? He said, well, when we got in the room, they're already born. That tells me that once that baby was born, you couldn't kill it. You killed it before it was born. See what I mean? So this is mass abortion. It's so horrific we can't even imagine it. So in verse 17, the midwives feared God and did not, as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. So the midwives are Hebrew. These two midwives. There's other midwives in Egypt, but these midwives are serving the Hebrews. This is their full-time job. I mean, they're helping these mothers have children and to give birth. But they choose not to obey. So number 7, why did the midwives disobey the king's commandment? They feared God. That's exactly right. And they could not do that. They absolutely could not do that. Not to mention the fact that they probably had no desire to ever do anything like that. But they feared God, so they couldn't obey the king. He said, if it's a boy, kill him. If it's a daughter, she can live. So they feared and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. So then the king of Egypt calls for the midwives and says to them, why have you done this thing and have saved the men children alive? Why have you disobeyed my commandment? And by the way, this is the same thing that's happened in history time and time again. Remember when all the authorities in the apostles' day, they said to the apostles, you cannot preach in the name of Jesus. And in Acts 5:29, I believe it is, or 39, what did the apostles say? We ought to obey God rather than man. That's what they said. Does that mean we don't ever obey civil government? No. No, it means when we can, when it's in accordance with God's law and is not in discordance with God's law, then we can obey. And we should obey. He says, let every soul, in Romans 13, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. So we should obey the police officers. We should obey, the civil leaders. We should obey the legislators. We should obey, the laws that are made, our leaders. Those laws that are put into place, as soon as it's put into place, we're required by God to obey it if it's not in discordance to His law. But if it is, and if the law is contradictory to what God has already said, then we're not to obey it. And what's interesting to me, and I hadn't thought about this before, and maybe you've thought about it before, but was this before or after the Ten Commandments was given? Before. See, the Ten Commandments was not given until Moses, who hasn't even been born yet. And the Ten Commandments say, thou shalt not kill, right? But that hadn't been said yet officially as the law. But see, these people that fear God, they knew it was wrong. I mean, without it having to be written as a law, they knew it was wrong to kill. And Cain, by the way, knew it was wrong to kill because he had a conscience when he did that, when he killed his brother. So, Ten Commandments hadn't been given yet, but they knew because they feared God that this was wrong. So he asked them why they'd done this. Verse 19, they give the answer. The Hebrew women are not as Egyptian women, for they are lively, and they're delivered heir. The midwives coming in them. So they're saying, hey, well, we went in to deliver the babies of the Hebrew, and they're already born. And notice Pharaoh didn't say we should have killed them anyway. So, that tells me that Pharaoh had some sort of idea in his head, okay, if it's before they're born, it's okay, and if it's not okay. If it's after they're born, it's not okay. Which is, it's a ridiculous idea. It's all murder, and this is a great passage about that, by the way, about abortion. It could have been without them knowing. What do you mean?
So if the midwife, as the baby's being born, is killing it, and the mother doesn't understand that she birthed a live baby, but it was killed.
And so they could say, it was a stillborn or something. Like so there's different ideas, right? So different reasons or different, we don't know what was in Pharaoh's mind, but, either way, it's an abortion. It's a killing of an unborn or a born baby. It's a killing of a baby. And a baby is a baby. And a baby is a human being that is entitled to the same rights of life and everything that you and I also enjoy. So the question is in question number 8, what reason did the midwives give for disobeying the king's orders? He said the babies are already born. So that's what they did. Now, were they lying? Well, sure, they probably were. But God blessed them, and God in this case, because they're saving people's lives and they're trying, God was going to bless them, and there was no sin, in my understanding, in what they did here. So they say, well, the babies are already born. So the king of Egypt, we don't have any record of how he responded to that. So it seems like he just kind of bought that. Said, okay, he seemed to believe them. So the midwife said to Pharaoh, that was verse 19, we read that. Verse 20, therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and explains to us how he did that. He dealt well with them. So he blessed them, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. Now, I've looked at that and thought about what does this mean? Is it saying that God built them houses to live in? No. Most likely what this means is that God blessed them with children. Now, nowadays, if you have a midwife, the midwife could be married and have children, whatever. But it's possible that this was their vocation, this is their occupation, and so maybe they weren't married. But God blessed these midwives, and he allowed them to be mothers. That's what it means. He allowed them to be mothers. He gave them families. He gave them children. And God blessed them because they saved other people's children. He gave them their own children. So God really blessed them. So how did God reward the Hebrew midwives? That's number 9. Okay, and we can say he gave them children, or we can say he gave them a home or family or something like that. So God gave them families. So, and then we see God build them houses, and then verse number 22, or he made them houses, and verse 22, and Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born, you shall cast in the river. Now, this is hard to digest. He just told them, if you have a baby, and there you are wondering the whole time, is this a boy or a girl? And then that baby's born. He says, if it's a boy, you throw him in the river. Now, I don't know how any mother or father, for that matter, could ever do that. However, also keep in mind, because of the tyrannical form of government, if a father or mother knew they had a boy and did not throw them in the river, they could be killed. I'm just trying to, help us to imagine what this was like. So most of them would probably obey the commandment. And so that's why when we come to the story of Moses, they obviously did not want to kill their son, but they had to hide him and just kind of hope for the best that somebody would, they put him in the basket. So versus just throwing him in a river. So again, I don't like thinking about it, but I think most of the people probably obeyed that commandment just for fear. And we can't, it's easy to blame them, I suppose, for that. But they knew that there were people, and the other thing too is there may have been people employed for that very task. So in other words, and I'm sorry to belabor this, we don't really like to think about it, but in other words, there could have been people that were assigned to that task so that it was almost like the state was involved, and if you had a boy, you had to hand them over to this person, and he would dispose of that baby. So that if you did not do that, you would be found out pretty quickly, and judgment would be upon you. So this is the world that the children of Israel are in. The people of God find themselves here. So why did Pharaoh want all the baby boys killed? Well, we could give some answers there. He wanted to reduce their population, right? Population control is what that is. He thought, well, obviously, if you don't have man and woman, you're not going to be growing. You're not going to be multiplying. So let's just get rid of one, and then it's going to stop. If you have all the girls and then all the boys are dead, well, eventually you're just not going to have it. You're just going to die off. So that's his idea. Again, this is quintessentially the same idea that any tyrannical form of government has. I mean, places like China, places like North Korea, all these places, they also do population control. This is still going on to this day. Population control, finding ways, infanticide and different things, finding different ways to get rid of people, to lower the population. That's still going on to this very day, unfortunately. So we see that Pharaoh wanted control. He didn't want them to overpopulate because he wanted to make sure that they were under his charge. So what is it? Well, it's the ultimate display of the evil human heart. That's all selfish, doesn't care about anybody else but themselves. And without any external influence from God, this is the way people can go. And so that's what's happened here. So we have a few closing questions. What part of the story can we relate to the situation in our world today? Any thoughts on that? Absolutely. Killing of babies. Yes. It's hard to believe, but that's been a problem from the beginning, it seems. Anything else? How does it apply? How about the control, the government control? They're trying to have control of their people and control the population, all of these things. And along with that, let's think about this. What is Egyptian bondage a picture of? Well, exactly right. Sin. It's a picture of how we're bound to sin. We're tethered to sin until we get freed from that. And we're going to learn, of course, about that. So Egypt has always been a picture of that and the control that sin has over us. And Pharaoh is almost a picture of himself because of the control that he wanted to have. Because sin just wants to take charge and control of you and make you do what it wants to do. So what does this story show about how God cares for his people, and what does it teach about earthly authority versus God's command? So the first question, what does the story show about how God cares for his people? Any thoughts on that? Absolutely. So he protected them, and he used these midwives to protect them, but he made sure that they were protected. He protects his own people, and they continue to multiply amidst all of this. What does it teach about earthly authority versus God's commands? Yeah, so we're going to obey God rather than man. When there's a discordance and a disagreement between what God says and what man says, then we're always going to obey man. So we can say that these midwives had some fortitude and some tenacity to be able to stand up and just say, I'm not going to obey the king's command. Because remember, they could have been killed if they were found out and knew what was happening. They could have been killed for that. And so that was, I think, a display of boldness, no doubt about that. So we're obeying God rather than man. Now, I look forward to learning about Moses. Basically, the remainder of Exodus is going to deal with Moses. And so he's going to be the central figure. But this first chapter is setting the stage, the backdrop of what the children of Israel were dealing with, where they lived, what types of things they encountered. And I think throughout the book we're going to see some similarities even to what we may be experiencing today. And we see how all these things also apply to us as well. So I'm enjoying it so far, and hope you can join us continually on Wednesday nights as we continue to walk through this book. Let's pray together, may we?